Welcome to episode 22 of the Developing Life podcast. We are diving deeper and deeper into the possibilities and complexities of artificial intelligence, encountering more and more opportunities and an equal amount of challenges along the way. But before we wind up way over our heads, how do we make sure that the technology does not swallow up the human experience? Today, we are excited to have with us technology executives and husband and wife duo, Dave and Helen Edwards. Helen and Dave have been working together since 2009, stepping into the AI space in 2012. Since founding their company, Artificiality, in 2019, they have dedicated their decades of experience and expertise to exploring the intersection of AI with cognitive science, complexity theory, philosophy, and design. Dave and Helen are not only seasoned professionals, but are thought leaders who challenge the mainstream narratives of AI, striving to balance excitement about its potential while critically being aware of its limitations. With our host, Heather Crank, we'll take a deeper look into how Helen and Dave combine the sciences and humanities to help humans make sense of AI roles in our lives, ensuring that these advanced technologies are developed and implemented in ways that truly benefit humanity.
Thank you, True. Helen and Dave, welcome so much. I'm so glad that you are joining us on the Developing Life podcast. I met you a few weeks ago, and I am thrilled to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself and let us know anything you'd like us to know before I dig into a bunch of questions?
Sure. Thanks for having us. I'm Dave.
I'm Helen.
And we're happy to be here. It was a beautiful introduction, so I'm happy to dig into other things if you'd like, but we're excited to be here and talk about all those things.
Okay, well, let's get right into it. So I met you here in Bend, Oregon, a few weeks ago. How did you guys end up coming to Bend?
Me.
It was you.
It was me. It was because of mountain biking. So we came for the mountain biking and we kind of stayed for the skiing and the general outdoorsiness. But that was the main thing. The Bay Area was kind of doing my head in from a mountain bike perspective, and the community up here is just fantastic, and the trails are awesome. So that was why we came. But we've built a life here, and it's a great place to live.
I agree. So if you came to Bend, my next question for you is, how did you start working together? How did you meet and begin your journey into AI? I know you have separate paths. Like, how did you fuse your mission?
That's a good question. And both of us came into, we met in a work environment. We met with a sort of a shared interest in technology, and at the time it was in clean tech. And my career had been in the power grid and in the new technologies on the power grid. And Dave's was all over the place, that plus, sort of these other technologies that hang on to the power grid, so solar and wind and what have you. And we got into that because there was sort of an obvious place to start building more expertise and helping people think through what's going to happen as the grid is decarbonized. But as we got into that work, what really ended up biting us was as in getting bitten by the bug of the underlying changes in the software that needed to happen to make a truly smart grid. And by the time we got to that point, we were like, oh, it's all about AI, because this is the much more interesting thing for us. So that was how we got into it, was through working. I did some work for an AI company in the Valley that was trying to apply their technology in the power grid. And we got really entranced by how artificial intelligence was going to change how we interact with the world. And the thing that the sort of first stepping stone that took us into that more broad application of AI was having a couple of kids who were about to go to college and saying, well, what do we study in college if the robots are going to take all the jobs? And we were like, well, the robots aren't going to take all the jobs. That's a crazy idea. But let's figure this out. What's the right way to think about a career and human learning and human creativity and human flourishing if that's what a career is about. What do you want to learn? How do you want to apply that? And what's the way to think about doing that in conjunction with AI so that you leverage both strengths of humans and of machines? So we did a big study in 2016 on that and came up with some really interesting conclusions that guided our kids, guide us, and still are really relevant today.
So what are those conclusions?
The number one conclusion, and it's still relevant today, and you'll still hear it talked about all the time, is that AI it learns from historical data. So it can never handle truly unpredictable, truly novel situations. That's the job of a human. And we're learning a lot about what it is about biological intelligence that it allows us to do that improvisation, that using affordances in the environment to jury rig and move around spaces that are completely unknown. They're not just combinations of things we've seen before. That's what AI does, combinations of things we've seen before. That's why the large language models, people say they're creative. They're creatively combining in ways that are beyond what a human mind can do. That's creative, truly is.
It is.
It's definitely creative. Whether it's any use and any value, that's a different story, but it is creative. So that core nature of being able to handle unpredictable situations. Then that's the overarching thing. There were sort of 5 key areas. There were dealing with environmental things and hazards. So biological hazards, environmental hazards. That's a very, requires human judgment. Spatial applications, spatial reasoning, you're using AI for this all the time, but spatial reasoning is something that's very important and very important to the way that we judge the value of something in space. So architecture, things like some of what a lot of people like to just dump in the general category of soft skills, but sort of reject that simple classification. Things that are very about social coaching and social negotiation. So it's not just about being a therapist. It's about being someone who manages a whole lot of therapists, for example, or manages more complex situations that are more difficult to handle. There were the sort of handling math and finance, but making decisions where those judgments have multiple outcomes. So some of these, yes, you can have an algorithm pick stocks for you or whatever. But if you really want to understand how to, how do you make sort of these more deeper financial judgments and handling the ambiguity that comes with mathematical analysis, that's obviously a major area. So those were kind of the key.
Yeah, and the way we got to it was interesting because we started by looking at the question of the time was kind of how much automation would impact employment, right? And there was a well-covered study from Oxford and another one from McKinsey, and these folks all came out with sort of their projections of how many jobs would be impacted by automation. And it made a lot of noise in sort of that 2015, 2016 timeframe because they were quoted as, 42% of jobs are going to be replaced, which was actually an inaccurate assessment of the research. That's not what they said, but that was generally what the coverage was. 47, right? But it was actually 47% of jobs would be impacted.
Because 42 is the answer to
everything
in the universe. So if you ask him any question, he'll say the answer
it'll be
is 42.
So, but it was it was actually that 47% of jobs would be impacted. But we sat there and said, well, we weren't quite convinced of how the studies were done and so forth. So we did our own. And so we started by looking at the entire, database of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. We used our own projections of all of the different types of tasks and skills and capabilities that AI had at the time and how we projected how that would be developed over time and applied that against this huge database of all jobs and everything that everybody does at work. And we came up with our own projection, which was similar but different, but we were looking at it as like, what's the opportunity for actually sort of amplifying humans at work, and how would you think about it as an investor? Then we took it and we said, well, hold on a second, let's not look at where the automation is. We're curious because our kids were saying, what do we go study in college? Let's turn this upside down. where are the jobs that actually, and the fields of expertise that have the least capability to be automated? That was a really interesting sort of inverse of the project. And so we ended up, I was constantly crashing Excel because I was only doing but that's how we came up with these answers. And so it was a very ground up looking at exactly at how jobs are reported. There's strengths and weaknesses of that database, right? And it's all about reporting about what you do. And so there's some gaps there, but it had some strong grounding in data and fact that we came up with those conclusions.
Wow. You are super prepared. I'm really impressed. Your children are set up for success. So riffing off that, so you're reverse engineering careers that could be interrupted and careers that may flourish. The creative industry right now is in a huge disruptive period. I'm being affected by that. I know a lot of people are being affected by that. How do you feel about the current level of disruption that is happening and sort of the AI rhetoric and hype cycle, and it's either going to destroy us or it's the best thing ever? How do you feel about this? Or your thoughts?
I think that I think that at the moment, I feel like we're in sort of what I hope would be the worst part of the cycle for the sort of anxiety for the creative industries, right? Because there's an expectation, a projection of of incredible capabilities from AI and creativity. And there's some that are there. But really the fear is about sort of what will these tools do? And so, it doesn't feel like a day goes by without LinkedIn, somebody putting up a little generative AI video and saying,
a day, an hour.
Yeah. And this is going to replace everyone in Hollywood. And as long as you stop with a small amount of critical thinking, you'll recognize that, guess what? Sure, there's a lot of, repetitive content that can come out that might be able to be replaced based on previous data. But if you stop and watch any TV show that seems a bit too predictable, then it's not a very good production. And that's, anything that's, as Helen was saying, anything that's novel, anything that's new, right, is something that is anything that deals with unpredictability is a truly human skill set that we have and we will have over and above AI for quite some time, if not forever.
Well, for as long as we keep doubling down on transformers.
Exactly.
Something will break us out of this eventually, but we don't see what that is.
But the fear is justified. The fear is warranted. I mean, I get why people are concerned. I lived through this a little bit 20 years ago. Or even more now that I have to remember to date myself to more than 25 years ago. I was the first product manager for a tool called Final Cut Pro. And when Final Cut Pro came out, I vividly remember we took the demos down to Hollywood. We're going around and we were the professional editors at the time who had to be, it was a certification or a licensing or something, to even be able to run an Avid booth.
Wow.
They thought that we were going to kill the editing profession, because it would be, anybody could do it and it would be too cheap and it would take all the money out of it. Well, now you have millions of people using that tool, millions of people using Premiere, the Avid, editing bay that you had to rent by the hour is gone. And now lots of content is made with these tools. But the fear up front was very real and material. People worried about their jobs, that suddenly somebody else is going to be able to do this for cheaper. And that's going to put me out of a job. That is a constant, refrain. Now, I don't think we are the techno-optimists who say, well, guess what? We'll always find something better to do, right? There is patterns that new technologies have created new fields, and there's disruption that's painful, but other jobs emerge. This is different, however, in that this is a different kind of technology. We've never made something that has a level of intelligence in it. We've never made anything that has at least the potential to be able to make decisions and take actions on its own. We've never had this capability of this mass creation that happens within the software itself, not at the instruction through command-based interfaces that we've built over the last 40 years. We don't really know where this is going to go. I still think that, rolling the dice, my bet is that it's going to be more enabling for creativity than not. It's going to create a higher level of expectation of creative output, right? But that will create clearly disruption for certain people doing certain things.
Mhm.
We struggle with ourselves. If you look at our website, artificiality.world, you'll notice that we use our images are from Midjourney.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that is not displacing anyone. Really, I mean, prior, if this tool didn't exist, maybe we'd still be using Adobe stock, which obviously does have a revenue source behind it for photographers and image creators. But we might not be using any images at all because we kind of got tired of stock images over the years. So we struggle with this question of what does it mean to use these tools? What does it mean in terms of the creativity that went into these tools? How do we think about the most responsible way to actually, be creators ourselves? So it's not an easy answer, and we're constantly rethinking what that means.
He's usually more optimistic than me. That's generally how our lives work.
True.
In terms of the creative fields, as opposed to creativity as a broad human endeavor.
Yeah.
Creative fields, I feel a little pessimistic, and not because of the technology at all. I actually feel quite positive about the technology. I feel really negative about the system in which the technology has been adopted. The bias for automation over augmentation. There's a lot of talk about how humans are so special and how we need the human touch, and will people want to watch things made by machines or read things made by machines. The early data is a little troubling. The early data is that, guess what? A lot of people make kind of bad stuff, bad writing, bad this. So if you read it and it's written by a machine, you don't know it's written by a machine, people tend to prefer it. That's kind of, there's lots of consequences and outcomes from that. In the creative arts in particular, I think that there's a real short-term concern, which is that people, and this has happened before, that people will, that are decision makers that don't understand the depths of what's required to make a truly creative product will say, oh, we've got a machine to do this now. Yay, let's just do that. And that in 2 years from now, they turn around and go, oh, actually, that didn't really work. It wasn't that great. But those people who had jobs and livelihoods have had to go and figure out something new. And that is actually the history of technology disruption that isn't talked about enough. It's, 10 years ago, people would say, oh, you're a Luddite, without actually understanding that the Luddites had a really good point. And they were fighting for their livelihoods. And being a Luddite is a term of derision now, like you're sort of, you don't want to use technology and you're kind of backward and maybe you're a bit dumb and uneducated and you're not willing to get with the program. But the reality is that when we disrupt society this way, it's really bad for everyone. And these utopian stories are terrible stories because they're all based on getting rid of people and jobs. And I haven't spoken to a single person who actually realistically wants to go and spend their life on the beach getting UBI that they don't believe in, because they know that none of that is actually going to be how it rolls out. That the reality is one of more of the hardcore economics. And the hardcore economics is that the supply of creative content explodes to the point that demand cannot keep up with supply. It's completely saturated. And in economic theory, what happens then is the price collapses. And we are seeing this, right? We're seeing the price of research is collapsing. We're seeing the price of and so if you're an illustrator and you used to charge $20, what can you get? Can you charge 2 cents, 20 cents? And so, this is well documented with music streaming. And I think that that's what makes me optimistic about the tools and the technology, but pretty pessimistic about the societal system in which we're adopting it, which actually is what matters.
Yeah, and I guess I had one more thing, which is not to be overly optimistic one in the conversation here, but just the sort of the questions that I have as we think about the creative industries, which is an industry we spend a lot of time thinking about, is if you look at some of the past, you look at the whole evolution of digital filmmaking, digital TV, special effects. Early on, there was clearly a concern about the FX industry, right? As soon as CGI started to become a thing, it was just going to put everybody out of jobs. It didn't. I mean, there's a huge CGI business because movies changed and everybody started adopting these things. Now, people's skill sets and jobs were disrupted for sure. Like, I'm not trying to make this out to be, I'm not being, trying to make this out like there wasn't a challenge. And that also bled over and created essentially the entire gaming industry, which didn't exist and is now a massive industry and employs a whole heck of a lot of people. Now we run the risk that there's some of this, somehow, computer generated, generative AI is going to displace even the gaming industry. So then there's this question of, well, where does human creativity go? Where does human desire go? Does something else happen that we don't know yet? Because I don't think, even though I was around at very early gaming stuff, right, in the 90s, when we were the first technology I worked for, Macromedia, one of the things people used Director for was making games. Would not have seen the explosion that's happened in the gaming industry. We just couldn't have predicted it. So there's that sort of question for me, is what happens when things shift and change, and where does that go to? And there's sort of that, broader than that, is sort of this question of whether there's different sort of art forms that can emerge. What is the new way of making film that does things? And the last thing I'd say is whether there's economic shifts that happen in the overall creative industries. And I'm thinking a lot about film and TV at the moment. But right now you spend gobs of money on these huge action films, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But then you also have these very high beta, small scale productions that are very human based. You're not going to remove, the people that are in the small indie films that sometimes are a huge breakout success. Now, if you can make those action films cheaper, because it's pretty easy to take Tony Stark and make him fly across the sky using a generative AI tool and not have to do all the crazy stuff there, and they make more money, will they invest more in other projects that are much more human-based, where they tend not to do as much of that today? Like, I think there could be some level of overall shift. I don't think our consumption or interest in creativity is going to decline. I think humans have almost an insatiable appetite for new entertainment, new creativity, new art. So the demand is there. So the economics are there. So the overall question for the industry is, if some level of cost is removed, does that cost get reapplied to something else? Because there's still the human desire to consume. Now, that's a lot of maybes and a lot of mights, and it's definitely the positive outcome, because I'm trying to think. We try to imagine what the hopeful future is. We don't deny the risk factors and all the negativity, and all of the disaster scenarios. We've done a lot of writing about existential risk, no question, we get it. But we also try to imagine the positive future, because our mind is that if we can't imagine it, if we can imagine it, we have a chance of creating it.
Well, and this is, we always talk about it, the excitement to fear ratio, because there's both. You have both going on at the same time. Excited by it, fearful of it, positive, negative. There's no, it's not a simple, this is great. And anyone who says it's all great is just deluded, flawed thinking, not rational. And what makes me optimistic overall is that this is kind of an evolutionary event, right? We'll get through this. There'll be new state spaces on the other side of this. There'll be completely new ways of thinking about what creativity is. And as we encode more and more of the human experience into these tools, there's more opportunity to see things that we've never been able to see before, to experience things we've never been able to see before. We haven't even started designing those. We haven't even conceptualized what it might be like to use an AI to truly understand how someone else is feeling, or to in a useful way. We haven't, I mean, obviously there's a negative side to that as well, but to enhance our own creative skills. So we're so early in this. I think the short-term disruption is really troublesome because it doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
You disrupt the whole creative industry, and you move people in and out of jobs, and you have to de-skill, you have to reskill so quickly. That has a real cost for society, and we don't talk about that enough. But longer term, you can see that all of these spaces that we consider to be creative now, there's no reason why they couldn't be 10x bigger with a machine showing us, helping us as a cognitive crutch to see different things.
I love all of that. I'm going to push back just a little bit. So right now there's a kind of a upheaval with a lot of artists. And I'm going to focus just for a minute on Gen AI. I know AI covers a huge area where we've got sites like Cara, where they're no longer putting their work up in spaces where they feel that their images can be scraped. I'm seeing lawsuits starting to go through now. How do you feel about the way that AI is training and the ethics behind it? And how can we move forward in a more responsible manner? Because I feel like with Gen AI, artists have really had to bear the brunt of this disruption, specifically so that other people could benefit because speed equals profit. I'm guessing that's the part of the underlying methodology. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I think this is the biggest value transfer that's ever happened in human history. I think it's awful.
Yeah, and I throw in that it's in addition to artists, it's writers, and we are writers.
Yes.
So everything we've ever written has been consumed, right? Now we have some amount of what we currently do, which is behind a password paywall, but I don't know how much they get beyond those, right? So we have the same, we live that both sides of this, right? So we're both having all of the work that we've done is consumed, right? Has been consumed, not with our authority, not without anybody asking. We have copyrights written on everything, whether it was our own individual work or stuff that we've written on, large scale publications that we've worked for in the past.
Yeah,
that's all copyrighted work, and it's all been consumed, and that's really troubling.
Well, and I think the stance from the AI companies is not just that it's public domain and on the internet, but because that's part of it, but the core of the stance is, well, a machine learns like a human, so we're just using that stuff to learn. And we know that there's been enough cases now that doesn't really stand up from lots of different reasons. And I think that it goes back to the point I made before about the socio-technical system that we're putting this into, that people like OpenAI think it's okay to do this.
Yeah.
They actually sense that there's no sense there. There's no consciousness that this maybe was just a little bit riding roughshod, maybe wasn't quite in the spirit of, maybe people are hurting because of this. And I think that lack of just sort of acknowledgement and awareness in this arms race forward, I think that's ultimately a huge mistake on the part of these companies, because it has naturally provoked an enormous and quite justifiable backlash. And this huge experiment that OpenAI launched on the world almost 2 years ago has biased everything towards large language and transformer style training. So we're not actually making the progress in terms of true AGI that we may have otherwise, assuming we want AGI. It's biased everything towards human replacement without a realistic promise of what's on the other side of that. It's taken people's work and livelihood and intellectual property and said, oh, well, you put it on the internet, so it's mine now, and I'm going to make money out of it. And it's created these inflated expectations about what a large language model can do, and bias people to using it for terrible use cases, which is then polluting the internet with crap. You know, literal just pollution. So I know I look at this overarching sort of socio-technical system and go, that's the bit that's broken. And so there's no point fixing the technology per se. What we've actually got to do is really think about what the human components and the institutions are. And that's why, even though some of our work looks a little bit kind of out there, it's really important for people to understand the narratives that are driving the strategies behind these companies. And the narratives drive the people, and the people hit the buttons.
Right.
It's not machines doing it yet, although, you know, not that far in the future, there'll be agentic parts of this equation. We better fix it before there are agentic parts of this equation. Because if we just have ChatGPT with its full agency going into the world doing things without it even being a prompt window from a person, God knows what crap it's going to come up with. And even though these models are incredibly useful and they're incredibly valuable and they're a massive step change forward in human understanding of what we create with knowledge, this abstraction that we have called a large language model that is a planetary scale intelligence that represents us. If we set that on the world now with the current bias towards getting rid of people and making the top people rich, apex predators, that's not a good outcome. So that's why but the reason we're so into imagining a different future is because that's what humans do. The machine can't imagine. We can't get ChatGPT to imagine us a future. It'll just give us a reflection of the past, all mushed up and turned into a sushi burrito. We need humans need to do the imagining. What's the new space that we need? So some people think that us saying we should imagine a better future with AI is kind of like, unicorns and lollipops and rainbows. It's not. This is hard. We have to do this. It's the most responsible thing you can do in AI at the moment is an alternative narrative than the one that's been pushed on us.
Yeah.
I think there's the part of the challenge is that we have established some level of norms in human to human consumption of other people's work, right? We had a fascinating conversation on this general topic with a musician named Jonathan Colton on our podcast. And Jonathan's interesting because he comes at the topic of saying, look, when I write songs, I mash things up over all the things I've ever listened to, right? I don't really know where I'm borrowing from other people. And there's some level of what the AI is doing, which is similar to what I do.
Well, that is the argument from the AI companies. Now, that's great when you're a human, because it's a biological piece of meat doing all of the updating of the model.
It is, but also
when it's a model owned by someone.
Yes, but also there is a distinction in that there are established norms and laws that support what he can do and can't do. Right? Now, sometimes that works, but you got artists who come out and say, you've copied my work, and there's some sort of lawsuit, and there's been a whole bunch of that going on in the music industry, in particular over the last couple of decades. Sometimes it doesn't work. Jonathan himself got himself stuck in one of these. So he did one of his top songs was he actually created a version of a Grandmaster Flash, rap song, but he created a whole melody to it, and it's this great little guitar thing, and it's awesome, right? And he got ripped off by the TV show Glee. Because they performed the song with his melody, which did not exist anywhere else in the world. But based on the laws and the way that song laws are established, he didn't own that melody because it was a cover of the original song. And so the most he could do is call them out on it. He has a huge fan base who made a big stink out of it and whatever. But sometimes the laws don't work even in the human-to-human part of the collaboration. It's not there to support the artist and what we really think is true art and their true contribution, which is what Jonathan definitely had. Now, what we're moving into in a world is where we have zero norms and zero laws and zero ideas of protections. When you deal with a machine that does this, we have nothing. And I think the biggest problem right now is just this mass rush to adoption, but we haven't figured out what we culturally believe is an okay use of this tool or not.
Yeah.
So
What
for instance, I'll
feels
give you,
fair,
so
you know?
we, as I said, we worry, we grapple with what should we use as images. If we weren't using that tool, we might not have any sort of the logic as well. I'm not sure we're using the tool, which is still, you can tell, I am the tone of my voice, I'm still struggling with it, right?
Right.
But let's say we had another interesting interview on our podcast with a guy named Richard Karras, who's heads Omnimedia for NVIDIA. And talking about Omnimedia and the fact that you could take an asset of a car and then move it from, it was originally filmed in Big Sur and you could put it out on Long Island or something, right? Something like that. They're using an asset that they own with film that they took, combining those things up. It's, where is there, there's some of these things that feel cleaner and a better use of the tool, even though it's a very different use of this sort of generative AI. But then there's other things that clearly feel really wrong. I go in and ask for, art based on a specific artist and get a replication of that. That's clearly wrong. You know this because we're working on this project together. You'll experience the rise at our upcoming Imagining Summit, where there's an artist who has had worked with an AI company to train an AI system on his art, so that you will be able to co-create art in his style. And then you'll be able to take that art and go off and do things with it. You could go make a t-shirt with it and so forth, right? But that's also okay because he gave it the go-ahead, right? It's his idea, it's his art, it's his contribution, it's his work.
Right.
These are all very different use cases where the technology is fundamentally the same among all of them. But some of them feel really right, I think, universally to people. I mean, I imagine that Patrick's thing, I don't know why anyone would complain about an artist saying, I like this using AI with my art. That seems to be a good thing for him. But then there's plenty of others where universally we feel like it's not a good thing. And then there's this whole messy middle where we don't really know. There's a lot of disagreement. And to me, it's not the technology is a bad, it's the how it's used is the problem. But we have this, world of big tech extraction, economy that is basically just rushing ahead and extracting as much as they can.
Right.
And so we're not having enough time to stop and think and figure out what might be a good use or not.
Yeah.
Historical reflection, we've got, I was around in the beginning of the internet days. I like to say the dawn of the commercial internet in 1995, there were 9 million of us online. It was a small community. It took a long time to grow, even though the dot-com bubble was fast, but there was a lot of time to kind of figure stuff out and to see where culturally we created some sort of new norm. But now we have this technology that's available to billions of people overnight, basically, because anyone who has a phone can access ChatGPT or Midjourney and the others. We don't have time to sort of slowly figure this out. And so it's been thrust upon us in a grand petri dish.
Okay, so taking all that information in, I'd like to hear more about your company, Artificiality, and the upcoming Imagining Summit you're going to have here in Bend, Oregon. I'm assuming you're going to address some of these topics. You have an incredible lineup of some pretty heavy hitters. What do you hope to accomplish with your company and with your summit? Like, what's the purpose?
Well, overall, the purpose of Artificiality is we really spend all of our time trying to figure out the fundamental answer to the question of what does it mean to be human? And how is that changing with this increase of synthetic in our life? This sort of synthetic organic merge that's happening. And that combined set of synthetic organic life, that state of being human, is the definition of artificiality, at least the way that we use it. And so that's why we focus on that. That's our true purpose, is understanding it. And a lot of that has to do with AI. That is the fundamental layer that we are viewing this world through. Now, there's longer term, there's much bigger ideas and much broader topics that fall into this, that we're spending time thinking a lot about what it means to the future of what it means to the future of self, what it means to the future of our minds, what it means to the future of our consciousness as we essentially merge with a synthetic version of ourselves and a synthetic version of the collective and this sort of planetary scale intelligence. So our whole vision of Artificiality is quite quite broad and quite long-term thinking. Imagining Summit itself, the purpose is to imagine a hopeful future with AI. And we've asked people to come together and to set aside the fears and the risks. As we say, we completely embrace those. We understand those. We reject the utopian view of Silicon Valley. But what we want to do is to bring together a group of creatives and innovators to help imagine what a hopeful future is, so that we have a chance at creating that hopeful future, right?
And we
don't just take the answer.
And we're doing that from a very first principles thinking basis, which is, what do humans actually need?
Yeah.
And what do they want? And so it's we've got cognitive scientists, we've got people representing how children use technology. We've got synthetic biologists who are right on the leading edge of understanding how we even conceptualize intelligence and information and life. We've got, like Dave says, creative musicians, artists, and designers, and we're heavy on the design side because design is how things work, and it's the way of it. So the output is tangible. We're going to produce a design philosophy, and we have some heroes in the field really helping us lead that take a leadership role in that process. Experts in AI design and long time experts in design and transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary design thinking.
If people are interested in joining this summit, how will they find out about you?
Artificiality.world, click on Summit. You'll see all the info on the people. We describe them as catalyzers because they're catalyzing conversations. This is designed to be a small interactive gathering, not a speaker audience. So there's heavy interaction among the people who we're bringing.
Lots of time to get to know people and get to know ideas. It's about access to ideas that you just wouldn't otherwise have access to.
But at the bottom of that page is a form to fill in to request an invite. We're doing it just to make sure we have, so we try to have the right balance of people in the room.
So don't have a very big room.
No, we don't have a very big room. But you'll look at it that we have, in terms of the people coming together, just rattle off some of the names. Don Norman, who, at least in my mind, created the field of human-centered design. He's there to talk about designing for a better world. Barbara Tversky, a legendary psychologist from Stanford and Columbia, talking about spatial reasoning, which is a really fundamental challenge with AI and a fundamental advantage and need for humans. Stephen Sloman, cognitive scientist from Brown, to talk about knowledge and truth. Jamer Hunt from Parsons School of Design will help us scale the problem. He wrote a great book about scaling problems called Not to Scale. We have Katie Davis, who studies kids and technology from UW. Jonathan Colton, I mentioned before, a musician, will be talking about his sort of vision of,
and hopefully writing and playing.
Hopefully, we'll definitely get him playing. We'll see whether he writes a song. We'll try and push him a little, nudge him a little bit in that direction. John Passmore, who is building an LLM that is specifically trained to better represent Black and Brown culture, called Latimer. We have Adam Cutler, distinguished designer from IBM, and Josh Lovejoy is designer from Google. They represent, in our minds, two of the real true leaders of AI design at big tech. And Michael Levin, of course, who's a synthetic biology professor from Tufts. And then we have some others. We're doing some short things. There's actually, we know at least one startup entrepreneur who will be launching and announcing his new company at the event. We probably have another one that I hope will actually also be unveiling what they're up to. So it's going to be pretty interesting. And this art project will be a very core experience of it. You'll be able to work with and create art along with Patrick. And he and his daughter will be talking at the event about their initiatives towards nonprofits and raising charitable gifts through their art and this collaborative work with AI.
Right. And I believe Patrick, he's part of RISE. Do I have that right?
Yes. Yeah, that is.
And they do amazing work where they support women and children initiatives. He's been creating work that supports women and children for quite a while, and I'm thrilled that he's part of it.
Yes.
I'd also really quickly, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to open up questions. I see a lot of questions popping up in the chat for you. But Helen, this is for you. Part of your history is studying and kind of predicting breakthroughs that happen specifically in science. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you see as potential breakthroughs coming in the next decade.
All right.
It's a big question. No pressure.
Okay, so I'll
How much time do you have?
I'll go to the
Give me cliff notes.
yeah, I'll go to the areas that I think are the sort of the most promising, where maybe less of a breakthrough idea and more of like significant paradigm shifts. Where are we actually, in the Kuhnian, like actually like definition of a paradigm shift? We're going through a paradigm shift at the moment in the way that we think about what life is. And that has real consequences for the development and use of AI, because it's very hard to, we don't, when it comes to figuring out what is actually alive and what life is, the science is going more and more towards life being about information at its core and computation and replication as part of this. Now, a lot of this is coming from lots of different angles. It's coming from people thinking about the nature of like origin of life, cosmology, that and where does agency come from? How can that possibly exist? Do we have free will? This sort of revolution in physics. But what it means for breakthroughs in AI is that we will get through this moment in time where we're kind of obsessed with large language models and transformers, and we will see breakthroughs in new ways of and new types of models and new types of algorithms. And you can see the sort of the pressures on the transformer architecture at the moment in terms of the nature of the compute, the question over scaling laws. You just feed it more data. Will AGI just pop out? No, I don't think it will. So there will be a breakthrough, I think, another way of thinking about the architecture of AI. So that's one. The second one is on the human side, we're not there yet, but I think we'll start seeing a bit of a breakthrough in a theory of consciousness. There are many theories right now. There's sort of leading ones, sort of not. But we kind of want to understand whether consciousness is an outcome of being alive, or whether it's an outcome of information processing, or whether it's always been there from the beginning, as some people like to think. And we're really wrestling with some deep philosophical questions in science around this, around how we think about subjective experience versus an objective reality. So it goes to the core of how we understand reality, and something will break in there. There'll be a breakthrough in there somewhere. Now, for most people, that's kind of like, what? Who cares? Just give me my mushrooms and let me move on. But the reason we care about it is that if we understand what it is that gives us a conscious, subjective experience, that mine is different from his, like we know how the retina works with wavelengths. I don't know if his version of red is the same as my version of red. I just don't know that. But if we get to these if we get to this point where we have these theories are grounded and landed, then I think what will happen between AI and the biological side is we'll do the same with consciousness as we're doing now with intelligence, and as we did with bias, which is we'll build systems that allow us to explore how much we understand it.
Interesting.
And it'll be just like it was with bias. We put it out there in math, and we can reason more precisely about bias in society. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have so many more conversations about prejudice and bias and all of that in society. One of the reasons is that we have the data on it now. We're able to reason about it.
Mm.
Now the word intelligence is dematerialized because we're building it. And as Feynman said, if I can't build it, I don't understand it. And so as we get these theories of life, these theories of consciousness, these new theories of matter, then all of that we'll test those by trying to build them. We'll try to build life. We'll try to build consciousness. And it won't just be in labs. It'll be on devices. It'll be in apps. It'll be in, connect, the neurotechnology, or the next AirPod will be a thought to text AirPod. I won't say, hey Siri, put on my podcast. It'll be, I just think it.
Sorry, I'm not sure who's speaking.
Right on cue.
enough.
Oh my God. That's brilliant.
So it actually gets really tangible really quickly. So what sounds really far out there and like kind of sci-fi, these technologies are actually doing this now. These theories and this empirical work is happening now. Apple patented the next AirPod to have an EEG. That is thought to text. Wow. That is there. That is so that I don't have to say, hey Siri, turn on my podcast. I just have to think it.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm not sure who's speaking.
Oh my God. It's really good. Poor Siri.
Who is this?
I was doing that deliberately just for fun.
Oh my God, that's really funny. Okay, so I have one question I'm going to ask here from Devron that he wanted me to ask before we open it up. He says in the World's interview, you talk about the incredibly valuable gift we have as humans to synthesize information, make micro decisions along the way, which result in a human story or connection. He'd like you to talk about that a little bit more. What does that mean?
Well,
what is human connection?
What is human connection? Well, you do the human connection. I'll do this, because you're the connector guy.
You go ahead first, though. I think you said.
Well, I think I did say that.
It sounds like a you thing to say.
I mean, what do we do when we synthesize? I mean, you think about I'll start with what's the difference between synthesizing and summarizing. Summarizing is something that ChatGPT can do. Can take a whole lot of facts and just sort of put them together and summarize it. Synthesizing has a value judgment. And value judgments come with consciousness and feelings and emotions. So as you synthesize and you make all these little, like, you think how long it takes for an idea to go from my head to his head and back. And what he does with that idea before he turns it back to me. That is connection. Solving problems together is what connects humans. If we didn't have to solve a problem or create an opportunity together, we wouldn't have a connection. It's doing those joint things together that makes the connection. But his brain is different than my brain. And I'd like to know more about that. I'd like to get inside that, like to get inside. And it's all these little backwards and forwards, these little trading as we solve problems, and the empathy that goes backwards and forwards and amplifies that bit rate between us. Machines don't do that. They can't do that. We do that. And the fact that we feel something, that matters. That's why consciousness matters. It matters that we feel something, because the feelings guide how we make these value judgments as we synthesize things. And the fact that he feels something and then I can detect that. Sometimes I can see it. Sometimes I can smell it. I know that you feel something. The fact he feels something matters to me. That's why reading something that's written by ChatGPT that someone else pressed a button on is boring, because we know that no one struggled in that. We know that they didn't feel anything to do that. They just hit a generate me text button. But so I think that process of developing human connection a machine can be part of that. AI can be part of that, but it can't replace it. And it certainly can't replace that process of synthesizing, because the synthesizing is all about a value judgment, and a value judgment is based on how you feel, and that's based on your consciousness. Machines don't have that. That's why I'm not so keen on machines actually having consciousness. And I'm not that jazzed about us always feeling like a machine does have consciousness even when they don't. And we know that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of gotchas in there, but that's kind of how I feel about that one.
Okay. Dave, thoughts on this?
I mean, I think that the part of the question about connection is important because for me, because human connection is it's important. It's how we live. It's how we create a collective. It's how we have a community. It's what society is. It defines culture. It defines who we are because we are part of who we are is who we're connected to.
Well, it's homeostatic. We die without it.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it is, but it is also though a mystery. We understand some of it.
Mhm.
We don't understand on other parts of it. We don't understand how we can actually understand each other. We can't actually define or describe how to compute, empathy. Some of that has to do with the fact that sometimes we don't even understand ourselves. You can have a reaction to something and go, why am I feeling that way? Right.
Mhm.
So part of this, journey is understanding that how much that we do understand about ourselves already. Some of it is discovering what we don't really know about humans and humanity ourselves. And as we try to extend humanity through a variety of synthetic life, we learn more about our own gaps of our own knowledge of ourselves. It's like, well,
Like the recent work on how our heart rates come into synchrony when we're making collective decisions.
Oh, yeah.
That to me just seems like some kind of crazy magic. It's
Mhm.
but on the other hand, it seems like completely intuitive because we talk about being in sync. I'm in sync.
Yeah.
We're on the same wavelength. So our language, our metaphors already take that into account. Science is catching up with whether that's actually happening.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. I think that's a good place to stop. And I'm going to allow people, if they would like to turn on their cameras. We're going to move into some Q&A. You two have given me so much to think about. Thank you very much. And I've got, while I am waiting for cameras to come on, I've got some questions here in the chat for you. So Devron asks, in your opinion, can you define a few of the things that you feel are already just superficial hype? And in contrast, can you define 1 to 2 cases or applications you're excited about in terms of AI tech?
Well, hype is at the moment generative search.
Yeah.
And some people are finding it really useful, but then they find that it's not useful and they change their mind. So generative search is not a fantastic use case. I think it can be made better. Will it take over how we use the internet and how we search?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. If you talk to the people at Google about how they're thinking about that, the way that works is if the responsibility for discernment and accuracy is very much with the user.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an entirely different user interface to portray that level of uncertainty in a result or what have you. So I think that's one where I think there's a great use cases is in science. We have let's just take a very simple example where there's how many scientific papers can people actually read? Like, you just can't. You need that to be collated and summarized and presented to you at the level of comprehension that you understand. Mm-hmm. And that my level of comprehension on something is different than Dave's, is different than a PhD in a field. And we can find what are called sleeping beauties, where papers that where people have discovered scientific knowledge 20, 30 years ago, and those papers were never cited enough, never became part of the network. But a large language model can find those papers. And those are often women, people of color, people that have never been in an elite university, those kinds of things. So that's a simple use case where you can go and find rare or overlooked knowledge. Now, I think that's a really great use case. There are tools that people are doing for that. Capturing human knowledge, people who are retiring. And when you think about how much knowledge someone has at the end of their career, and then it just sort of goes away. Now, sometimes that's good. We need natural forgetting. because otherwise we can never move forward to the new. But if you're coming into those jobs and you really need to sort of, well, how did that person do that? Sometimes it's really useful to know, and then it can be faster to know and then adjust than it is to reinvent from scratch. So those are simple use cases that I think these things are really well designed for. They're terrific at combinatorial creativity. Like that's just a slam dunk. Now, that doesn't, you need the human judgment that says, well, that kind of cookie's a bad idea and that kind of cookie's a good idea. But the ability to these convex spaces where if you imagine all of these different data points here, and the machine can take them and fill in these places in ways that humans can't do. Those are incredibly powerful exploratory use cases. You never need to write a template again. You never need to write a checklist again. You just have them all there. We're starting to learn where there's good use cases like personalized tutoring, but where the big general foundation models aren't good for that. You need a design layer to help. So if you're using ChatGPT to study for a math test, then you won't do as well on the test when you're not able to use it. It's a competitive cognitive architect. But if you use the tutor designed one that uses more Socratic methods, never gives you the answer, but prompts you to think for it through yourself, then you actually learn faster and do just as well on the test. So there's this whole sort of world of what's a complementary cognitive artifact versus a competitive one. If you take it away, you can't do that work anymore. So we're learning about how complex some of these use cases are. But I think there are some simple ones that really work.
I'll give you a couple of bigger level concepts that I think are important.
Big enough? Yours obviously hardly bigger.
So first is we talk about transitioning from the attention economy to the intimacy economy. So we spent the last 10, 15 years with our attention being captured, right? That's what the whole premise of social media is, and that's monetize it by capturing attention, putting ads in front of us. As we have more conversations with these tools, they are developing a more intimate understanding of who we are. And that intimacy is a risk for sure. There's a challenge that part of the economy is difficult. How is it going to monetize the intimacy? But the intimacy is what's required for these tools to really work for us. And when they truly have a depth, sort of in-depth understanding. The best example so far is the change, at least we've seen in the demos, towards the Apple Intelligence experience. So Apple Intelligence already has a level of intimate understanding of you, given the fact of everything that you put on your phone. So it's able to understand who you're talking about, where you want to put things, all these different concepts and things that it can move things around. That level of usefulness is so much higher because it understands you so well. That opens the door towards quite a lot more sort of really interesting, useful cases on it at an individual level. This is going to take time. This is a longer term thing. The other thing I'd say that I think is that I'm excited about is I'm excited and I'm also fearful of, is the use of agents. So as AI has agencies able to take action, some of this reward we think is going to be required to have an agent to basically be your interface to the digital world, because the digital world is getting flooded with generative content. So as AI floods the internet with bogus stuff, it's becoming nearly impossible to go. It's becoming harder, and it will become nearly impossible to find anything you want. And so there's sort of a question about how much you're going to need an agent to go find the thing you want, right? To go find information for you. But once it does understand you well, it can help you not just find what you want, but screen out everything else. We were on vacation a couple of weeks ago, and I sat there thinking, I wish I had an agent that could actually just interrupt me when something really important, try to be out of the office. And what are the things like, there's going to be some stuff that's really important that I want to know. Somebody sent me a message, some news thing broke, whatever. But if I had a great agent, just the ultimate executive assistant that would allow me to sit and look at the water for a week, but interrupt me when it's really, really important, it would be great. Now, that's one use case, but you can get a sense of how there may actually be a potential for this technology to abstract a lot of the toing and froing that we do with the digital universe, to be able to allow us to be more present in our day where we are. Now, I know That's a bit of a utopian point of view, and she's going to give me a hard time. But that's a long-term vision. Again, that's like we try to imagine a positive.
I'll take that little, like, I can tune out except for the one thing I need to know.
Yeah, exactly. Back to the beginning. You do that every time on your mountain bike. You'd love it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I would take that. That would be my kind of engine too.
Yeah.
Zach and Lisa, I saw you unmuted. Did you have questions?
The host asked me to unmute. Thanks for being here and speaking with us today. Thank you for inviting me, Heather.
You're welcome.
It was very informative and interesting to listen. I have been looking for, I'm someone who's invested his whole, his whole life in creativity. So AI potentially stands to, remove my livelihood. And I've been looking for the thing that AI doesn't try to imitate. And I came up with humor, spirituality as far as interpreting things in a spiritual manner. And then I got onto something called narrative therapy. And what that is about has to do with contradicting, rewriting your personal narrative, the narrative of your personal history. But now I'm thinking that ChatGPT would be a very helpful assistant in that process as well.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you on humor being one of the last things. In fact, the last time we were talking to the head of the director of the SFI Institute, David Krakauer, he said, there's a reason that humor is going to be one of the last things that AI can do.
Well, I like the idea of coming up with things on the fly, and we've all done it. We've all made jokes off the fly, like without thinking beforehand and constructing a routine, just spontaneously transforming the situation with humor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess
Agreed.
that's something AI could potentially be trained to approximate perhaps someday in the future, sooner than I think maybe, but it seems to be one of the last essentially human verities.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the key parts about humor is is highly context dependent. And we like to say the context is everything. Everything about how you say, the way we're presenting ourselves today is based on the context of this conversation. It's going to be different, when we're on stage somewhere or something else, giving a keynote. And so every time your interaction is about the context. And today, at least, AI has extremely limited understanding of our context. Today, large language models, you have to input it. You have to tell it all kinds of things in the preface of the prompts. It makes it really, and then you have to start again with every new one. And we're sort of thinking about the context we're giving it, and people get excited about, well, I can tell it to pretend to be this, that, and the other thing. And it's really crude and it's really basic, when you think about the potential.
Well, and it takes a statistical context as well. It will always, with the current architectures, will always take a statistical context. So anything that's slightly unusual will be difficult. And a lot of context has always got that yes, but.
And if you've ever been a performer, that every time you stand on stage, there's a context and there's a vibe to the room that you're reading and performing to. And there really isn't any way to describe that to anyone. There isn't any way to write that down.
Maybe intuition, maybe telepathy, but that's going too far for some people. But often it does depend on the audience, how funny you are, or how the effect you have. Always, I suppose, depends on the audience.
Sure.
Yeah, and the audience is noisy, not loud noisy. It's noisy in terms of there's a randomness to how the audience shows up, and that is the thing that it's almost the ultimate unpredictable situation for an AI and a human to deal with, which is going back to where we sort of started from.
Improvisation
is
required, and I guess an AI doesn't have that capacity, or maybe only in a very limited sense.
Well, and sometimes humans bomb too, right? And unskilled humans definitely bomb. It's the same, there's a little bit of an 80-20 here, and that we are seeing with the language models and with the multimodal models that part of what they're doing is developing a sense of context. much more so than the predictive AI sort of 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that they have a minimum viable level of context for comedy.
True.
They've got a minimum viable level of context for writing a poem for someone's birthday, or a haiku in the style of Barack Obama and Taylor Swift, or something like that.
Could an AI theory, I mean, I imagine they could, but could you say, come up with a comedy routine in the style of, Bill Cosby, Joe Rogan, whatever comic you wanted, and have it produce an approximation?
It'll approximate it.
Approximate.
Is it any good? Does anyone want to look at it? That's
Probably not.
Yeah, probably not.
Well, and it depends on the model, depends on the time, but it depends on what how the model is performing in a particular day.
How it was trained.
I play around with some of these models to try it in terms of voices that I know well. Even yesterday, I was taking something and comparing between ChatGPT and Claude, and rewrite this in the style of Bruce Springsteen, and just kid from Jersey, I know Bruce pretty well. So it's and
your bones.
Strangely enough, Claude was terrible. And ChatGPT was much better. And that would have been the reverse in my experiment, a couple months ago. So the behavior is of the tools is still quite variable.
Highly unpredictable.
Yeah.
Yep.
Liesl, do you have any questions for our guests? We're at 1:11. I'm probably going to start to close this down in about 10 minutes.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I love hearing and learning about these types of things. I think that Heather can probably guess roughly what I'm going to say, because whenever I'm allowed out in public, I say a version of the same thing, which is about the East and the West, and how, and I always say this, but I think it needs to be said, about how the North American, Northern European English-speaking hegemony tends to dominate so much. It has throughout history, and a lot of the discussions around it are different from the conversations that I hear in Asia. I've spent half my adult life in Asia, and it seems like the Asian viewpoint is there's a bit of divergence here in terms of where they think it's going and where they would like it to go, because of the historical dominance of the materials, the ideas and the thoughts that are recorded, the way they're recorded. And that goes down to everything from what's considered facts down to values. Of course, religion largely drives culture. So there's a slightly different viewpoint. Some of it's similar, but some of it's different. Have you researched that difference between the Eastern and the Western hemispheres of thinking? And if not, would you like to?
We've done some research on the attitude to surveillance, which is stark and kind of arresting. We haven't done any particular research about that difference, other than recognizing that there's an obvious schism there. From the perspective of there's almost sort of, well, if we're talking China and the US, there's two different internets. But if you're talking Asia more broadly, there's this difference between, what's obviously digitized and captured in data. So that's starkly different. But the entire philosophy of the collective versus the individual is a really big deal here. And it's weird in the sense that as we digitize more and more of our Western ideas, our Western developed economy, sort of Western philosophies, and we realize how much we put as on the individual, when it really is about the collective and the collective knowledge. And I think that that's one of the things that we'll all start to kind of grapple with, is that these tools are going to present to us the collective umwelt of humanity, with an English skew. But in doing so, we'll almost see how us as individuals are just part of this collective in a way we've never seen before. So I think it's going to be much more disruptive on the psyche of the West than it will be on the psyche of the East.
That pleases me to hear you say that, and gives me reassurance.
I think that as Helen said, we've done some work on that topic. I think I'm always kind of wary of how much I can expect to understand another culture and apply it to something like this, right? From the outside, and I spent enough time looking at some of these cultures over the years past and all the different technologies that sold into these things.
He's basically
places.
just saying he doesn't know what he doesn't know.
Yeah, and so I'm wary of that, and I think it's hard. I think it's difficult. I'm glad that you spent time living there as a totally different viewpoint than those of us from the outside. And I'm always sort of cautious if people make broad generalizations. Now, I will say that one of the other things that we have noticed, though, is that this isn't just an East-West, an English-speaking internet versus a Chinese-speaking internet, those kinds of things. When you get down to very, smaller and more distinct cultures, there's, very big differences too. As I mentioned before, John Passmore is building Latimer as an LLM to represent Black and Brown culture because he felt that those cultures were sort of not well represented in the global LLMs. Some of the data that's inside of Latimer, or that has been used to train Latimer, is proprietary data that comes from academic databases that doesn't exist on the public internet, that can't be present in ChatGPT. It literally is not there. We've spent some time looking at indigenous cultures, and have had had a very interesting podcast episode with an expert in Maori indigenous digital rights, and that's particularly an interest of ours, as you can probably tell. Helen's from New Zealand, and so we have a lot of sort of focus on that and interest. But when you get to that level and thinking about hearing him talk about how the Maori people think about data, and how culturally it's only in the younger people now who feel like it's okay to actually have their picture taken and digitized. When you hear that moment, you go, well, okay, so there's generations of people in that culture who have not been photographed. Well, that's going to make it hard for you to have a digital representation created through an LLM. Some of the things that he expressed in terms of common views of data and intelligence across the indigenous populations, how they think about culture and community and connection to the earth, is fundamentally different than what you'd consider the broad-based Western thought, because as you say, it's that Western thought is dominated by generally English-speaking white people. That's where, and a lot of the data that exists in the internet is dominated by that culture, because those are the people that were on it first and digitized first. And so we have this huge challenge of actually not having cultures that are smaller, less representative, being lost in these large-scale models that are dominated by particular cultures. One last little thing before you jump in is that we had the same experience. I was kind of surprised that actually the device over there recognized Helen's voice. I'm not going to say its name because I don't want it to wake up again, because actually for years she's been saying that it never understands her because she's got a Kiwi accent. Well, there's only 4 or 5 million people in the world who have an accent like hers. So guess what? The voice recognition systems just aren't that good, because they haven't heard enough of it yet. That's just one small little data point about how challenging it is to have these global planetary scale data systems represent what is an extremely robust and individualized culture across our humanity.
Absolutely. And hard relate there, Helen, on the accent. I'm Scottish. There's 5 million of us, and we don't get recognized either with our accents.
No, you probably have to put on an extra brogue because all it's learned is Sean Connery.
All it's learned is Sean
it's learned from movies.
Come
right?
on, Billy Connolly.
Yeah, Billy Connolly. There you go.
Billy Connolly.
That would be our favorite.
It's interesting because I get frustrated when people do research in other parts of the world, and what tends to happen is they tend to talk to people who are English speakers, because I do speak several languages, and I think that gives you. I always have these arguments with people saying you don't need to speak the language to understand the culture, and I'm always really like, for real, are you kidding me? Because you know exactly why you're very, very clever people. But when people do go and do research, you're relying on intermediaries and interpretation of that language. So if we can even misunderstand each other, as you were talking about earlier, when we're using the same language and we have the same cultural sort of norms and values, and then you're trying to extrapolate meaning across several different interpreters, and the gap and the distance between what you're observing and what the reality is becomes even greater. I think before there was digitalization, there was a lack of information in these cultures, because if you're studying medicine, for example, in Lao, you're not going to find a lot of textbooks that were written by Laotian medical professors there. And if you don't read English, you're relying on translations. They're twice as long by the time you translate, and there's a cost. So even pre-digitization, there was a smaller voice, just even with textbooks across the whole world. And it'll be fascinating to see how people like you help shine a light on some of those discrepancies. But I don't underestimate Asia. Asian people are on it as well, and they're going to make sure that they're heard. There's a lot of smart people on it there.
Yeah, and we actually want more complexity here. We don't want just English. I mean, English has simplified the world. It's more simple. It's easy to get around, and we can all travel and only really speak English. And with Google Translate or ChatGPT, you don't the requirement to learn a language is less.
It doesn't work with Thai. It is
the benefit
impossible
of
to
learning
translate.
the language is actually higher,
And
because you get the actual what we build in our mind when we learn that other language is the representations of that culture, and they're much richer than just the constraint that a language model takes and generates new text out of. And it's interesting to, it's one of those jobs that is, you could say that all translators are going to go away. Well, a lot will, but when you really need a translator, like when you really need a deep translation of the meaning of the actual the actual meaning of the language, the meaning of the culture, you won't be able to rely on any of these tools yet. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, you guys. We are at 1:22, and I feel like this is a great place to stop. I really want to encourage people to go check out Artificiality and the Imagining Summit happening here in Bend, Oregon this fall. It's October 12th through the 14th. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I am so thrilled to have these fantastic guests. And thank you to Liesl and Zach for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful week.
You too.